Welcome to Ripple Effects, Travelers with Disabilities Abroad, brought to you by the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, a project sponsored by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and administered by Mobility International USA. On this season of Ripple Effects, we hear the stories of international exchange alumni with disabilities and how their programs furthered their careers, skill sets, and personal development. This is part of a new initiative from the Clearinghouse called #LifeAfterExchange. I'm Justin Harford, a project coordinator with Mobility International USA and your host for Ripple Effects. Joseph Hill is a faculty member of the American Sign Language and Interpreting Education Department at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID. In 2008, he conducted doctoral research in Italy on a Fulbright. His international experience has not only informed his research direction, but the way that he relates to colleagues and students alike. Okay, Joseph, well, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And I think just to start off on the interview, I wonder if you could tell us just about your Fulbright and what it was, what you were setting out to research, and how long it lasted, what it was like. Just kind of give us the rundown of that experience.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. My Fulbright studies related to language attitudes in Italy within deaf education, which means I was investigating the administrators, parents, and teachers and their point of view in the use of sign language with deaf children. Some people are supportive of the use of sign language where others aren't, and so I was investigating that in my study.
And
Go ahead.
This was at the Siena School of Liberal Arts, is that right?
Yes, it was. The Siena School of Liberal Arts. That was the host institution for my Fulbright. I was given space there to do my work. And for my studies, I went to different schools in the country of Italy. I went to schools in the north, in Padova. And I remember Padova the most. I also went to Cosato, and I went to Rome, and then I went to Barletta. So I went to those 4 cities, 6 different schools, and included children from first grade through high school in my study.
Wow. And this, you have kind of over the years made your reputation as a researcher into questions of deaf languages in deaf culture. And I wanted to know, where does that research interest come from?
Well, it started years ago. When I was an undergraduate student, I was studying computers at that time, but I was interested in deaf culture and ASL because I was just wondering about ASL and what it meant, and that led me to graduate school. And when I was signing, I noticed people would judge the way I produced some of my signs, and that started to lead me to my dissertation work looking at attitudes within the American deaf community. And that was at Gallaudet in their linguistics program. So it just so happened that at that time, there was another part of the country, part of the world, and I was able then to go to Italy and apply the same curiosity in that context, in the Italian context. And so it was because of a connection through my advisor that led me to the Fulbright and allowed me to continue my research in Italy.
Wow. And I wonder, can you tell us a little bit maybe about your personal, obviously we're speaking to you through a sign language interpreter. I wonder if you could tell us about your personal experience with sign languages, and if there's any sort of connection between that and your research interest.
Sure. You wanted me to talk about my reasons for doing my research on language attitudes or my Fulbright focus? Which would you like me to answer?
I think just I think we're kind of curious about how you're with just kind of with your personal experience as somebody who uses sign language every day to communicate. Um, if there's any sort of connection between the work that you did on your Fulbright and that personal experience as a signer growing up in the U.S. In getting connected to U.S. deaf culture.
Sure. Thank you. Many people are not aware of this, but I was born to a family. I've got deaf siblings. I am the youngest of four. We're all deaf. My parents, my mom is hard of hearing and my father is hearing, and neither knew sign language. And so they did not teach us to sign. And so we grew up speaking and using the oral method to communicate. I went to a mainstream program where everyone in the school spoke. And so I really wasn't connected with sign language until about the age of 10 through an interpreter. And I was learning sign language from the age of 10 and on. Now, I grew up in Ohio, and other states, the states around the U.S., it's not all the same sign language. It is ASL, but there are cultural variations. And also there are some systems in the school system that is called Signing Exact English, and that can cause confusion. And so I was a little confused at that time. I didn't know a lot about the language. I would see these variations, and they would mention ASL as being different, and I wondered what that meant. And so that's why I became curious and wanted to investigate ASL versus Signing Exact English. It wasn't more about style. It was wondering what the difference was. And Signing Exact English is really not a language. It's a way to sign in the English syntactic word order. And when I learned about that, that increased my curiosity and led me to graduate school because I wanted to learn more about ASL as a language. I wanted to learn about its linguistic structure. I wanted to learn about how it was different than other languages.
Fascinating. And I know whenever, it seems like whenever we go abroad as people from different identity backgrounds, we experience our identities in different ways. When I was abroad in Latin America as a blind person, I would have described that experience as learning how to pick my fights, because working in a different cultural context, people react in a different way. I know that you kind of had a different experience or a different perspective on that as someone who is deaf and also from an African American background. I wonder if you could tell us what that was like for you. In terms of how people in Italy reacted to you, how you responded ultimately to those reactions.
Speaking about my experience as a Black individual in Italy, or Black American visiting Italy, most of the time, in general, I had very positive experiences with people. People were more curious about me as a Black deaf American who was studying for their doctorate degree. For them, it was a very rare experience for them to meet someone like myself. But I did have a few negative experiences. For example, the week that I had arrived, and it was the orientation week for the Fulbright scholars, there were some strangers on the street. I didn't know who they were. I hadn't met them before. And they were gesturing to me, pounding their chests as if they were talking about me being an ape or a monkey. And that is clearly based on my skin color, but they don't know who I am. They don't know where I'm from. And so those things happened rarely, but most of the time people would ask me questions about my background. When they see me as a Black person, they assumed I was from Africa and not from America. I get that question most of the time. Most of the time, people were very curious. And when I would interact with people, I needed to change my point of view because they weren't being rude. they just weren't familiar with who I was, and they didn't know how to interact with me and didn't know what to do with me. They hadn't seen someone of my stature before. So that's where their curiosity came from, and I needed to change my point of view when interacting with them, and it worked out most of the time. People were very friendly towards me.
Mm-hmm. It's almost kind of like we were interviewing Kenny Fries, who's going to be in another episode, and he talks about how he found that there was that in disability, and also with his experience as somebody who's both gay and Jewish, that he found that first from his experience in Japan and then going on to Germany, each of those places, and in the U.S., each of those different areas had a completely different cultural context that kind of affected the way that people understood these different diverse identities. And I kind of actually, I guess, hesitated to describe you as African American in the context of Italy because it almost is people relate to you differently, and it sounds like I noticed you use different language to describe yourself as someone as going in the Italian context. And I'm kind of curious. It sounds a little bit like this is kind of similar to that, where you go to a different country as someone as a black person or as a deaf person, and the way people relate to your blackness or your deafness, it completely is different because of that completely different cultural historical backdrop.
I definitely agree with what you just said. It seems that, yes, I was there as a Black American. Well, I was a Black foreigner from America. But how they related to me was different than how they would relate to people from Africa. So I guess I was an oddity in how I responded. And when they knew about America, they would treat me different than a person who was from a country in Africa. So it was interesting. It's very interesting.
And I wonder if you could tell us a little about what now. I mean, you research, you teach, you've worked at a couple different universities as faculty, and I wonder if you could tell us if some comment about how your experience in Italy, whether noticing how people react to different identities based on their own cultural and social history or anything else, how that experience has impacted the way that you teach and research now in your career as a university faculty.
Yes, I'm trying to think of how to answer this.
Sure.
After my experience in Italy, I spend a lot of time thinking about my own identities and perceptions, and then thinking about how I can give back to America. I'm thinking about those perspectives, feeling more understanding about how people see things, and understanding that I can't make those assumptions because I don't know the point of view from which they come. Mm-hmm. So I include that in my teaching with students because students are young, and I feel that it's important for them because many of the students that I teach are not deaf, they're hearing. They're often working with people who are different from them. And so I'm encouraging them to see perspectives that are different than their own. Because most of the time they see their own perspective, and it's enlightening when you can put on someone else's perspective that, it's not that they're wrong, I can understand where they're coming from. And so I try to include that in my teaching. Also, I do encourage them to study in other countries if they can, or go to other countries rather than staying in their local environment. It's good to get out and, face reality, whatever that reality may be. It's very powerful to learn from those tough experiences. Sometimes it can be very transformational. And so I encourage that as well with my students. Also, for as far as research goes, my research direction has changed. Before I was focused more on language attitudes, and now I have shifted more into social aspects of culture. and how they influence language differently, how people interact with each other. And so that's been a shift in my research. And I think if it were not for my experience in Italy, I probably would have continued in the vein I was going on with language attitudes. But this shift has been an inclusion into my research.
Wow. Excellent, excellent. So you're probably for future projects, that's kind of more of the direction that you're going to be heading in.
Yes, absolutely. For example, I have been involved in a project called Black ASL, which we were looking at sign language in southern states, because in America, schools for the deaf were segregated. So Black deaf students and white deaf students didn't have contact with one another. So their communication exchanges with one another was diverse. It did not happen. So the languages evolved in a diverse way. And so we look at part of what made that happen. And so trying to look at what is present in the Black deaf community. And so I'm researching the life experience of Black deaf families so that I can share that and have that content be involved in deaf studies courses and deaf education to get a larger point of view on the deaf experience, to see a different perspective rather than seeing the same perspective we've always learned about with deaf individuals.
Right, like rather than seeing all deaf people as being exclusively affected by their deafness, recognizing that there's a lot of cultural diversity in the deaf community as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. We really appreciate this time that we had with you, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes and consider sharing us with your networks. Also, let us know what you think at Twitter @MobilityINTL or Facebook Mobility International USA using the hashtag LifeAfterExchange. And to learn more about hashtag LifeAfterExchange, go to miusa.org.